So, in the lecture on second wave steampunk, I talked about how I used the Wayback Machine to look at what books were at the top of the steampunk Goodreads list in 2009. It was William Gibson and Bruce Sterling's The Difference Engine, China Miéville's Perdido Street Station, and Anne and Jeff Vandermeer's anthology Steampunk. Now, some might wonder, like, why use Goodreads at all? Why would any of that matter? Well, this is something that I started using a few years back when I was teaching a course on magic realism. And people kept asking me if I was going to include any Neil Gaiman in the course. And I was like, Neil Gaiman? Why would I include Neil Gaiman in that course? And I would do web searches, sort of popular web searches, magic realism books that you need to check out. And Neil Gaiman kept showing up on those lists. And I was like, Neil Gaiman doesn't write magic realism, at least not according to what it is, by what the experts say. I'd been doing my secondary source research and reading what, people who are considered experts on magic realism had to say about what that is. And I thought, I don't understand where this is coming from. And so I went on Goodreads and looked at the magic realist lists there, to see what do most people think magic realism. And on the one hand, you have experts who say this is what it is, and then you have the people buying stuff, and categorizing it as things. And this is all born out of, by the way, this particular kind of approach is actually born out of a response that Gail Carriger, who I'm going to talk about today, had to a list of readings that I'd compiled for a speculative fiction course at MacEwan University. And my first pass at it was, I put it up on Facebook, and she said, well, that would be a great list for academics, but it's not a great list of what people actually read. And I was like, wow, yeah, that's so true. And it made me think about how academia often approaches the study of literature, that we have course after course after course on all sorts of things, but I have yet to see a course on the romance novel, which is one of the most popular genres of fiction. So why is it that we don't teach that unless it's by Jane Austen? So this is interesting to me. This is something that I think is worth our attention, looking at how the perception of a genre or a subgenre or a category of books changes over time. And we can talk about these sorts of things in a sort of abstract or theoretical way. But what I love about Goodreads is that it actually gives us an opportunity to see numbers, to have some statistics, to get something that is arguably hard evidence, or at least far more objective evidence than just sort of riffing on what we think reader response theory might be. I mean, if you want really serious reader response, go check out what people on Goodreads have to say about particular books, and we can collate a lot of data based upon these numbers. And we can admit that there are potentially problems with the way that we're gathering that information, but when there's serious studies being done on human sexuality via dating sites, why aren't we leveraging the opportunity that we have as scholars of literature to use something like Goodreads, where there's all this information, all this data, and we even have testimonials? Like, this is the sort of thing that you'd have to set up a massive study for, and you pay people to come in, and then they'd have to read the books, and then you'd have to get their feedback. But what you get on Goodreads is you get that feedback without saying, we're studying you, right? There's none of that bias involved. There's all sorts of other biases at work, but that is not among them. Anyway, in 2009, we have these three books. We have The Difference Engine, we have Perdido Street Station, we have the Steampunk Anthology. And then in 2009, Gail Carriger's Solus is released, among other books, but we're just talking about Carriger at this point. Carriger's Solus. And why? Why do I want to just talk about Carriger's Solus? Because if you go to Goodreads today, some, 12 years later, 13 years later, and you look at the shelved steampunk books list. Shelved lists are people just, they read a book and then they get to shelve it as am reading, but they can also tick off other boxes for shelves they want to categorize it as. So they might categorize something like Solace as paranormal romance or humorous or something like that. Many people categorizing it as steampunk. So many categorizing it as steampunk that it is number 1 on this list. China Miéville's Perdido Street Station, which was once among the top 3, down at number 24. William Gibson and Bruce Sterling's A Difference Engine, the classic of steampunk, down at number 30. And the Steampunk Anthology by Jeff and Ann Vandermeer over on the next page. I'm only just looking at the first 50 books in this little study that I'm going to do out of 12,313. Now I am genuinely interested in potentially going through all 12,313 of these at some point and drawing some conclusions about that. But for today, I just want to take a look at the top 50 because I think it's super indicative. I mean, top 10 lists. What do people really like? What has been super successful? And that isn't a guarantee of quality, but it is indicative of what people think a thing is. And the way that we use language most broadly is the way we communicate. So an expert can push back on this and say, but that's because they don't really understand. They don't really understand what steampunk is. That's why they're voting this thing up to number 1. I'll tell you, Perdido Street Station should be up at the top. And there are lots of people working in science fiction and fantasy who are huge fans of China Miéville. And, rightly so. Miéville's a great writer. I enjoy his stuff. I find his prose a little pretentious, but he's got some wild ideas and some cool concepts. But he also has a very particular worldview that quite often aligns with what literary scholars want to be talking about in the classroom. Miéville allows you to talk about big, important things like politics and ideology and like whether, justice and fairness and all this sort of thing, and like the way that we treat others, and those are worth paying attention to. This is not me being like, we should never talk about those things, but there's this sense in which China Miéville slots very easily into the kind of reading that a lot of literature courses are devoted to. Reading for meaning, reading for deeper meaning. We're going to talk about how this is, meaningful. And the Difference Engine potentially along those same lines, although it's the kind of text that you can now problematize in terms of its representation of women. Mostly, the book is mostly concerned with men, and its representation of women is in some ways regressive. Whereas we could talk about the representation of women in Gail Carriger's Solace as progressive. But there are people who would say they don't want, like academics who'll be like, I don't want to do that because Solace is silly. It's a comedy. It's a romance. I can't take this seriously. This isn't worth our attention. This isn't worth scholarly attention. And my pushback on that is that if we're not paying attention to what people are actually reading, what is it that we're doing in English departments? Is it just a book club for the things that we like? This is the stuff you all ought to be reading. That sort of prescriptivism thing. You should be exposing yourself to these big ideas. Maybe that's what we're about. I don't know. I'm interrogating all of these things via this approach. Well, we've got Carriger up at the top, and we're not just looking at Carriger as number 1. Carriger is in several places along here. We can see, looking at this list, Soulless, Changeless, Blameless, Etiquette and Espionage, Heartless, all up there in the top 10. And we can break down that top 10 along with the top 50 to take a look at women writers and steampunk. And the reason that I'm focusing on women writers and the reason that I called this lecture Women Won Steampunk is that because men dominated not only steampunk, but science fiction and fantasy at large for a very long time. And in science fiction, at least, when women came along, and it really saying women came along, there were women in science fiction before Anne McCaffrey, before Ursula K. Le Guin, doing what they did in the 1960s. But they would publish under pseudonyms, they would publish with their initials. C.L. Moore did not go, hey, and by the way, I'm a woman, loudly and proudly, working sort of under the radar to be able to work in a man's world. But Anne McCaffrey, Ursula K. Le Guin, when they came in, got to be shuffled off to another corner called soft science fiction. And there was an argument that it was like, well, that's because their science fiction is ultimately about the soft sciences. But Campbell's Who Goes There, there's the novella that was what The Thing is based on, John Carpenter's The Thing, is more an interrogation of social and psychological concepts than it really is biological ones. Like, it really, at the end of the day, does not really get down into like how cells work and multiply. It's more like, if I get taken over, will I even know it's me? If this alien absorbs me and becomes me, will I even be aware? Now, you could write a narrative about that today that would be hard science involving neuroscience, but that's not what that original novella was. But McCaffrey, Le Guin, and a lot of other women, soft science fiction. You go over there and you be soft with the soft science fiction that you write. And the same sort of thing started to happen with steampunk, where people came up with terms that were gendered for the kind of steampunk that Carriger was writing, that Sherry Priest was writing, Melching Brook, and it was like, we're going to put these people over there, and they will get to be this other punk. And I resisted that, and I continue to resist that to this day, although at this point, I gotta say, I don't honestly know that anyone needs me to be resisting that when we take a look at this list. So let's get into this list. Solus, up at the top, shelved 4,886 times as steampunk. I don't know much about statistics, but I think we're getting close to a statistically viable sample set here. Leviathan in place number 2 by Scott Westerfeld, another one of the books that came out in 2009 and really began the second wave, or announced the second wave of steampunk fiction, shelved 3,351 times as steampunk, so that's considerably less than 4,886 times. And then Carriger's next book, Changeless, shelved 3,162 times as steampunk. So lots of shelving going on here. If we take a look at how many times Carriger's books appear in the first 50 shelved items on this list, and the reason I went for the first 50 is it's just the first page that you would come to on Goodreads, and you would scroll all the way to the bottom, and there you've come to 50. And I thought, I'm going to stop there today rather than going on to do the thousands more that are ahead. So this is a limited study, but it's indicative nonetheless, and especially because it includes the top 10 with thousands of readers weighing in on this. Gail Carriger has 11 books out of the 50, so 22% of that first page. She clocks in at number 1, 3, 5, 6, 8, and 9 in the top 10. Sherry Priest, who wrote Bone Shaker, which was another one of the books that, along with Westerfeld's Leviathan, announced the second wave in 2009, has 4 books on this list. So she's got 8% of the share, and her Bone Shaker clocks in at number 4. So we fill in one of the gaps that Carriger has left. I mean, Carriger's got most of the top 10, but Priest fills in the gap between 3 and 5. Cassandra Clare, author of the Mortal Instruments series, did some steampunk books set in the same universe called The Infernal Devices. And the first book in that series, Clockwork Angel, clocks in at number 7, filling in the gap between Carriger's 6 and 8. She's got 3 books on the list for 6% of the share. Cassandra Clare was an established author, unlike Carriger, who was a complete unknown when she released Soulless. Priest was also largely an unknown. She had a few books to that at that point, but not. She was not a name. She was not out there. But Cassandra Clare certainly was when she began working on her steampunk content. And then Meljean Brooke has 3 books on this list for 6%. And the first book that appears on this list comes in at the number 10 spot. So in the top 10 of shelved steampunk books, only 1 male author, 4 women authors, 4 female authors. And I mean, we can get into the particulars of how gender isn't quite, we're not just working with the binary, but today I'm just going to be working with it from that perspective for simplicity's sake. So, when I say Women Won Steampunk, we're looking at the women in the top 10 have 42% of the share, I guess we'd say, of votes in that top 50. And if we look at women in general and not just those women, that number goes up to 70. And then what we have remaining, and I've put the 70 over top of the women in this slide, and then I have 26 way over on my side of the slide because I'm a guy. So the male authors on that list make up 26% of the top 50 of the shelved list, which I trust a little bit more than the Listopia ones. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But then the 4% in the middle is for books that were either authored or edited by men and women. So there was like they were either writing together or editing together, or they're anthologies that contain a mix of male and female writers. If we move over to Listopia books, the numbers change. But the reason that I don't trust Listopia data as much is because those lists on Listopia are created by users. And we can see with the best steampunk books list that whoever started it wanted very badly for everybody to adhere to a certain definition of steampunk. Wikipedia defines steampunk as a subgenre of fantasy and speculative fiction that came into prominence in the 1980s and the early 90s. The term denotes works set in an era or world where steam power is still widely used, usually the 19th century and often set in Victoria-era England, but with prominent elements of either science fiction or fantasy, blah, 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 like those found in the works of H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, etc., technological developments, these other things. And it feels very much to me like a list that's going, this is what steampunk is, and don't put anything on this list, because it says right at the bottom, please only add books that fit the steampunk definition and have steampunk listed on the book's main genre page. Well, just because someone slaps the name on the cover doesn't make it steampunk necessarily if you're going to be a gatekeeper. Because, I mean, you look on this list, this just kills me. H.G. Wells' The Time Machine is in the number 5 spot, and I'm like, this shouldn't, as far as I'm concerned, that shouldn't even be on the list. If you want to start a list that's called Steampunk Antecedents, and you can put that one on there. But, if you're talking about books that came into prominence in the 1980s and 1990s, that one shouldn't even be on there. So I'm always a little bit suspicious of Listopia lists, but I wanted to include them just for fairness sake, and I wanted to include their data. So best steampunk books, women writers only make up 40% of this. And in this, what I would be interested in doing is like actually looking at like other forms, the sort of broader lists of science fiction and fantasy to see how these compare. To see like, do we have a larger number of women writers in steampunk for one reason or another? 8% to the shared works and 52% for the men on the Listopia Best Steampunks list. Then we get the Listopia Best Popular Steampunk Books on Goodreads, and the number 52 now moves over to the women. 5% for the shared, 43% for the men. But on both the last list and this one, Soulless, or Carriger Soulless and Cassandra Clare's Clockwork Angel continue to be in top spots, in the top 10 spots. Bone Shaker by Sherry Priest, still in the top 10 on that best steampunk books list. And then on this best popular steampunk books on Goodreads, it's just starting to read like Protestant denominations where they're like, we're the first Anglican church of the such and such. And this is like, how many definitions, how many like different adjectives do you have to shove in front of this one to sort of, this is a different list than the other ones that you've been looking at. But best popular steampunk books on Goodreads again has Cassandra Clare and Gail Carriger up at the top. But now we've got Lindsay Buroker's The Emperor's Edge, which I have not read and I'm not familiar with, moving out Sherry Priest's Bone Shaker from top spots, but women with 52% of the share on this one. Let's take a look at another list. Best steampunk novels. What makes them best? I always wonder, like, what's the criteria here? And I always wonder that too, even when I'm like engaging with other academics. Like, what makes a book the best example of whatever it is that you're studying? Like, people have asked me, like, why didn't you include the difference engine in your course? You should have included the difference engine in your course. And I'm like, yeah, maybe I should have. But I've learned over the years that, like, trying to get students to read really long novels is a fool's errand. Even English students are not, it's not that they're not interested in reading long books. It's just, if you're going to put difference engine in your course, 3 weeks, because it's that long. You should be allotting 3 weeks, enough time for people to read it, do close readings of it. A week is not enough time to do that. That's just drive-by reading. And so if we're really going to take a close look at works, then I don't think we should be using like these great big vast tomes. The other side of this is that I'm looking at this information on Goodreads and I'm like, is the difference engine as influential as academics would like to think it is? Or is that just something that we've sort of assumed out of the same misguided attention that academia gave to cyberpunk? Because cyberpunk, like Mieville, was just full of those big ideas that we all wanted to be talking about in our classes. It was doing things that were like more literary and sophisticated in ways that align with how we normally read novels. Because science fiction and fantasy don't play by a lot of the same rules in terms of like what they're focused on. Quality, like what makes a quality fantasy novel is very distinct from what makes a quality literary novel. It isn't necessarily going to be deep character development, but instead the generation of a secondary world, a secondary fantasy world. How do you, or in science fiction, what is the novum? What's the new thing that you've introduced here? What's the new technology or new alien species? What counterfactual concept are you playing with? But cyberpunk seemed to align easier with the kind of stuff you'd be doing in other literary courses. And so there's a lot of academic attention that's been paid to cyberpunk. And I can't help but wonder, is that one of the reasons why the difference engine got any of the attention that it did from academics looking at steampunk? And I don't want to say that that's all the case, because I certainly know that in the case of Helena Esser, who, is, as far as I'm concerned, Helena Esser is the steampunk scholar now. If I ever was, Helena Esser is the person who is now the steampunk scholar. Written so many great academic articles, just great stuff, and really good work on the difference engine, and sees it as a valuable addition to the genre. But again, when I look at these lists, I'm like, I'm not seeing people digging it. So if I'm wanting to approach steampunk as a popular genre, or approach it in a way that is meant to study what it is and not what I think it should be, then this kind of information is valuable for me. But again, best steampunk novels: Carriger, Clare, Priest in the top 10, and many women in the top 10 again. And why have I abandoned, the percentages? Because that takes an awfully long time. That's information that I'd love to go and gather another day. That's information that you, as a listener, whether you're one of my students or not, that's a study that, we can all be part of. But I think that this is one of the ways that we can use Goodreads to come to these sorts of conclusions, to draw attention to the areas that we ought to be studying when we enter a new genre that's on the move, that is continuing to be a moving target, that isn't like, we're not looking at the Romantic period where It's not happening anymore. Or the Victorian period, it's not happening anymore. So when we study things like neo-Victorian fiction or magic realism or steampunk or whatever it might be, that is a modern genre, a modern category that continues to evolve. I think looking at things like Goodreads can help us to see the big picture. Because I remember when I was doing my dissertation, I was getting tons and tons of books for review, but they weren't necessarily the books that were gaining the most popularity. So I read a lot of steampunk that was sort of like, well, that was terrible, and it as it turns out, it didn't last. We'll get to something about that in just a second. But here on the best YA young adult steampunk books list, we've still got Carriger, we've still got Claire, but here we get Katie Cross, and her Steampunk Chronicles, the first book, The Girl in the Steel Corset. This was published through an imprint from Harlequin. So romance. Definitely romance. Bone Shaker, it's still in the game on the best YA steampunk books, but it's been dropped down now. Katie Cross's series shows up on a number of these lists. All of the books are there. So it was quite popular. I remember reading Girl in the Steel Corset. It always felt a little bit like Steampunk X-Men. I enjoyed it. I thought it was a ton of fun. Again, not a really deeply serious book with all sorts of like big ideas. YA steampunk books. So the last list was another Listopia one, best YA steampunk books. Now we get the YA steampunk books as shelves. So again, the sort of thing that people just click. The Listopia, people make lists and they want you to come in and vote and add stuff to it, but it is initially curated. Whereas shelves are just curated by people deciding, I think this is that thing over there. And the list for YA steampunk books, Carriger's Soul List drops and is replaced by Etiquette and Espionage, the first book of her finishing school series, which on the other lists is there, but further down. Cassandra Clare's Clockwork Angel still up in the top. Katie Cross's Girl in the Steel Corset up in the top. And we look at all of these, and anyone who's read them knows they all contain romance. So let's take a look at the shelf for steampunk romance books. Top book on this shelf, Melgene Brooke, who we've already seen. Melgene Brooke's The Iron Duke. Shirtless dude on the front cover. Maybe that book should have been called Shirtless. Sorry, I'm just looking at Soulless, Carriger's Soulless on the same page, and I'm like, The Iron Duke should have been called Shirtless. I like my own jokes, okay? And then we look at all these. This list is very different. We've got Beck McMaster, who has appeared on some of the other lists, but not this high up on it. Melgene Brooke's series is right up near the top entirely. Carriger appears here, but not as strongly as on other lists. But Carriger runs across all of these, up at the top. And most of the top 10 of every one of these lists is dominated by women writers. And I think this is significant. I think it's something that we need to pay attention to, because these books don't just appear on the steampunk romance book lists, they appear on the steampunk adventures list. They appear on the butt-kicking female steampunk list. There's a name for you. But there they are, over and over and over again. In 2009, if somebody was going to have taken a bet on what the future of steampunk was going to be, I doubt they'd have said it was Carriger and Claire. I suspect they'd have been pissed off if anybody had suggested so. Some people were. I know, because I engaged with those people. Had some arguments about it. And, like I've said, I've recommended Carriger and Priest and Westerfeld consistently to people looking to write master's thesis, PhD, dissertations, but they come back and they say it's not sophisticated enough, there's not enough depth here, and my pushback is, then you have to admit that steampunk isn't a deep genre. And then just at least acknowledge that and say that you had to go fishing around for whatever book was super deep. Now, I don't think that's actually true. And I also don't think that Carriger's works aren't looking at serious and important things. I think they are. But if we want women writers who are working with serious content, we need to look no further than the last lecture with Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda's monstrous graphic novel, monstrous comic book series. We could also look at Nissi Shaw's Everfair. It's an absolutely fantastic novel, but it's difficult. It's a tough novel. It's a little bit more like The Difference Engine. It's a genuinely rigorous investigation of alternate history in the Congo, steampunking of African history. And I don't want to make it that broad, but just to clarify for people. And I think it's a beautiful book. But it doesn't show up in these top lists. We don't see it being terribly popular. So, maybe that says something about what we do as readers, as humans who read, or just North Americans, because we have to remember that, a lot of these lists, the lists that I'm looking at anyway, are looking at these books in, the context of the English language. What I also love about Goodreads as a space of research is that it gives us the opportunity to see how many times a book has been reprinted. And I think that's valuable as well, because if we have to find a really out of print book, like I remember people saying like, this really obscure book that no one remembers and no one gives a crap about that's really where steampunk began. And I'm like, well, let's take a look at how popular that book was, how many times it was published, how many people would have had hands on it. I mean, like, I can think that Karel Zeman is the bomb. But at the end of the day, I can't argue too strenuously that Karel Zeman's films, these very strange stop motion adventure films were more influential than Disney's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It would be asinine for me to argue so, but sometimes it's like people want to argue those things. What Goodreads can afford us is the ability to see how many editions there are of a book. We take a look at Carriger's Soulless. There are 55 editions. And many of those are in other languages. So once a book is brought into its second edition, we know that it's doing well. But if it gets published in other people's languages, that's another level of success. And I love looking at the covers from these I want to say, I hate the word foreign, but at the same time, this is the German cover, and this is I love the Russian cover. I absolutely love this image of the heroine and her paramour on the cover. It's very steampunk. They've both got, she's wearing something that looks kind of like a bowler, and he's wearing a top hat, and it's got goggles on the top. I mean, this is drawn directly out of second wave steampunk. Very comic comic style art, which is similar to what I think is my favorite cover for Soulless. The Japanese edition has a manga style cover. Never mind that Soulless was turned into a manga. That there was a manga version of it that was serialized in Japan. And the only other steampunk books that were given that treatment, Cassandra Clare's. Says a lot about the weight that those books carry. And so when we're studying a genre, when we're looking at something, I mean, we can go looking for the thing that people tell us, like, if you read this, it's all about this really important thing with like capital R, capital I, capital T, really important thing. Okay, sure. And then we talk about those really important things. But again, it's just we're working out of a very prescriptive space. This is the way I think things ought to be. It's not that we should never talk about those things. It's just that I think that if that's the only place that we go in for our research, we're ultimately not really looking at the thing we say we're researching. Just like when Gail Carriger gave me crap for having this very academic list of science fiction books. That's not what people are really reading, Mike, she said. Same thing with steampunk. If you're doing a steampunk course and all you have on it is Blaylock, Powers, Jeter, and then you have the Difference Engine, call your course first wave steampunk, because you are not studying steampunk in general. And I will readily admit that my focus on narratives in this little study is not indicative of steampunk widely, but it is indicative of steampunk as we would study it in English. where we study literature. We'd have to do a different sort of approach to look at, what's the greatest steampunk film that was ever made. We'd want to go, onto the equivalent of Goodreads, right, for film. But when we were talking about really important things, I said, I don't really think ultimately that we aren't looking at really important things when we're studying Gail Carriger's novels. And when I've taught Carriger's work before, and I remember talking about like the way in which she imagines werewolves in America as metaphor for outsiders, for the disenfranchised, for potentially, homosexuals, because they're treated in lots of ways like homosexuals have been treated in America, like LGBTQ people have been treated. Carriger's novels have been praised by the LGBTQ community for their portrayal of queer characters. She's not nearly as progressive as some other people in her use of BIPOC characters, people of color, but they are there nonetheless. If you chart the flow of her writing, she becomes bolder and bolder as she gains what I would say is publishing power. That at the outset, she's looking at a very long game. At least that was my original assumption. Although I've read that, on her blog, she talks about how she wrote Solus sort of on a bet to just write a book that people would want to read, to be not an artist but an artisan, to just look at the publishing industry as a job. And so, in some of the same ways probably that I identified some of the stuff that I talked about today, Carriger went and looked and said, what are people reading? What do they like? And then she gave it to them. And when she gained enough power, just like Jules Verne, way, way back, when he wrote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, he wanted to give his character of Captain Nemo a very particular nationality. But his publisher wouldn't let him, because if he had, it would have pissed off the Russians seriously. And they didn't want to do that because France and Russia were allies, and the publisher was like, we don't want to make enemies with people who are going to be buying our books, because this is business. But there came a point when Verne had enough clout to just say, I'm going to make Nemo who I want him to be. And he changed from his original intention of making him a Polish aristocrat, and instead made him part of made him part of the Sepoy Mutiny in India. That Nemo had grown up under the British Raj, and this is why he hated England. And he did that at a point where he could. He had enough clout. Once Carriger had enough clout, she didn't have to, sort of play safe and do the sort of thing that most romance publishers want their writers to do, and was able to exercise those things. Really important things. They're there in Carriger's books. But I'd argue that the really important things that we could talk about from Carriger's books aren't the things that we will often gravitate towards in academic literary studies. And yet today, the day that I'm recording this, dawns with a world on the brink, or well over the brink, of global war, nuclear threat. And I think about something that Gail said to me once. She said, I asked why did she think her books were so successful? Why was she going from a complete nobody to a repeat New York Times best-selling author? Nearly every book she's published hit the New York Times bestseller list. And I said, why do you think that's the case? What is it that your books have that other steampunk doesn't? She said that when she started investigating what she might want to write about, she noticed that steampunk was gaining influence, gaining attention. People were getting interested in it. but she noticed that most of the steampunk that was cool at the time, China Miéville, was quite dark. And she said that really wasn't where she wanted to operate. And she said, I think that almost all of us, or I think she actually said all of us, I don't know, but most people want to laugh and want to love. And when, again, going back to romance is the top fiction genre in terms of sales, she's right. But on a day when things are so very dark in the real world, I can't help but wonder why we don't teach or investigate or analyze why we read to escape. How we read, how we engage with fiction as a form of almost self-medication. I've been listening to the audiobook for Etiquette and Espionage in preparation for teaching it next week. It's one of Carriger's finishing school books. And it makes me laugh. And every time I laugh, I know from the hard sciences, I know from neuroscience, that I feel better. That it's good for my mental health for me to laugh. And as I listen to the book and I sign the fictional contract and I fall a little bit in love with the characters, I know that despite the fact that I'm not really falling in love, my brain is engaging with the same sort of chemicals that are produced when we do fall in love. It's one of the reasons that romance is so enjoyable. It's why it's so pleasurable to watch or to read. It's why we can, and when I say we, I mean us as a culture, reading formulaic book after book after book after book. I was in a used bookstore once. I watched a woman come in with a box of Harlequin romances. So tiny little slim Harlequin romances. Plunk, down on the counter. The guy goes, hey, and called her by her first name. Just go ahead, you know the routine. One for every two you brought in. So it's a 2-for-1 deal. This is a great big box. They were all Harlequin romances. Did she go to diversify her reading? No. She went right over to the romance section. Just doop, 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 doop. And I know from friends who are authors who have tried to get into writing for Harlequin or who were approached to do it, that they have a very, very serious boilerplate template that they're like, this is the convention you follow. So see if you can write a story in this that feels a little fresh. Why would people read those over and over again? I want to know. And I think neuroscience has the answer for us. We like to fall in love. It's how our species gets perpetuated. But if we can be tricked by the lie of fiction into falling in love, that's an enjoyable ride, isn't it? And Carriger's books are about love and laughter. And those are really important things. And so for everyone who's working on a dissertation or a master's thesis or maybe a paper in my course, don't forget that those are two of the most important things in the world. To be able to make someone laugh or to make someone fall in love when they're not really happy or they don't have an actual person there to fall in love with. When the world is on the brink of disaster and we just take a few moments to escape into a world of werewolves, ghosts, into a world of vampires who love really good fashion. I mean, the opening of Solace will forever to me be one of the funniest things I've ever read. That a vampire attacks the heroine, and her response isn't, oh no, a vampire, it's, you didn't ask politely. A joke made on the manners of polite Victorian society. I'll always love that opening. But they might be comfort food. They might be comfort food. But we want to stop and consider, why we aren't studying the things that comfort us so in fiction, in film, in the beautiful lies that we create in steampunk, in science fiction, in fantasy, in romance. So, when I say Women Won Steampunk, I've got hard data. to demonstrate it. And then after all of that, I also have what I think are really good reasons for why we should be studying it, why we should be paying close attention to it, and why we shouldn't be disregarding it in favor of what we might consider the really important things.